The sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona territory as Daniel Hawthorne clutched his notepad with trembling hands, the sweat dripping from his weathered brow and stinging his eyes. The military escort party snickered among themselves as the aging newspaperman cupped his ear yet again, his face flushing red with embarrassment when the Apache tracker named Nantan had to repeat his findings for the third time. The commanding officer rolled his eyes and muttered something that made the younger soldiers laugh even harder, their mockery cutting through the desert air like the heat itself. Hawthorne stood alone beneath the scorching summer sky of 1893, his once prestigious career as a war correspondent reduced to this: a half-deaf old man chasing rumors of a jaguar across the frontier, desperate for one final story before the changing times left him behind completely. The journey had begun 3 weeks earlier when Hawthorne arrived at Fort Benson, with letters of introduction and clippings of his past glories. The fort commander, Captain Reynolds, had greeted him with thinly veiled contempt. "Your glory days reporting the war are long past, Hawthorne," the captain had sneered as he reviewed the request to join the expedition. The only reason Hawthorne received permission to accompany the supply column was the telegram from an old military contact back east, and even then the captain made it clear that the newspaperman was considered nothing but a burden. The soldiers assigned to the expedition made no effort to include Hawthorne in their conversations around the campfire, speaking deliberately quickly when he was present and laughing when he leaned forward, straining to hear. Nantan the tracker was different, a mescalero Apache with deep knowledge of the land and its creatures who had been working with the army for nearly a decade. The Apache was himself an outcast, viewed with suspicion by both his own people and the white soldiers who relied on his skills but kept him at a distance. During the long nights on the trail, while the soldiers clustered together, Nantan and Hawthorne formed an unlikely alliance of necessity. Hawthorne learned that Nantan had lost his son years ago in a raid, a wound that had never fully healed. The tracker spoke slowly and clearly so Hawthorne could understand, sharing stories of the changing landscape and the vanishing buffalo herds that had once darkened the plains like storm clouds. The expedition pushed deeper into the rugged terrain, following reports from ranchers and travelers of a large predator stalking the region. The first sign came near a small homestead where they found a calf torn apart, in a manner unlike the work of wolves or mountain lions. Nantan examined the tracks with careful precision, his fingers tracing impressions in the dust that were invisible to untrained eyes. "It moves like shadow between shadow," Nantan explained to Hawthorne, who wrote everything down in his careful script. "The jaguar is a ghost from the southern jungles, rarely seen this far north." Captain Reynolds dismissed the concerns of the homesteaders, promising only to include the incident in his report once they returned to the fort. As the days passed, Hawthorne noticed the subtle change in the soldiers, their mockery giving way to unease as they ventured deeper into the maze of canyons and dried washes that defined the Santa Cruz region. The land itself seemed to close around them, the towering sandstone walls creating passages that amplified the slightest sound. Each night the men built larger fires and posted extra guards, their bravado replaced by whispered concerns about what might be watching from the darkness. Nantan remained calm but vigilant, teaching Hawthorne how to read the subtle signs of the desert, from the way certain birds fell silent when predators were near to the almost imperceptible tracks that told stories of what had passed in the night. The discovery of the ceremonial arrangement of cattle carcasses changed everything. The supply column crested a ridge to find 3 dead cattle laid out in a deliberate pattern, their throats torn, but much of the meat untouched. The soldiers muttered about wasteful killing and savage customs, their eyes darting toward Nantan with renewed suspicion. Captain Reynolds ordered his men to burn the carcasses and make camp nearby, dismissing Nantan when the tracker suggested they move on to more open ground. Hawthorne noticed the concern in the Apache tracker, the way his hands moved restlessly and his eyes scanned the darkening horizon. That night, Hawthorne wrote by lantern light, describing the growing tension and the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows of the Santa Cruz Wash. The attack came with the first light of dawn. a blur of golden spots and raw power that seemed to materialize from the morning mist. Nantan had risen early and was checking the perimeter when the jaguar struck, a silent ambush that knocked the tracker to the ground in an instant. Hawthorne, awakened by the commotion, emerged from his tent to witness the massive cat standing over Nantan, powerful jaws poised for the killing bite. In that moment, the jaguar turned its gaze toward Hawthorne, their eyes meeting in a connection that froze the newspaper man in place. There was something in that stare, something beyond animal instinct, a recognition that Hawthorne would struggle to describe in the days that followed. The jaguar released Nantan and retreated, leaving behind a necklace of carved bone in the sand beside the wounded tracker. The camp erupted into chaos as soldiers scrambled for weapons and Captain Reynolds bellowed orders that went largely unheeded. Hawthorne rushed to Nantan, finding the tracker conscious but badly mauled, deep gashes across his shoulder and chest, seeping blood into the thirsty desert soil. The Apache clutched the bone necklace with trembling fingers, his eyes wide with recognition. "My son wore this," he whispered to Hawthorne, who had to lean close to hear the words. "It was taken when he disappeared." The soldiers wanted to pursue the jaguar immediately, but Reynolds ordered them to prepare a stretcher for Nantan instead, declaring they would return to Fort Benson with all haste. The journey back was slow and painful, with Nantan slipping in and out of consciousness as fever took hold. Hawthorne remained by the tracker, using the medical knowledge he had gained reporting from battlefield hospitals to clean the wounds and apply poultices from Nantan's own medicine bag. The soldiers watched with a mixture of respect and lingering suspicion, their earlier mockery of the half-deaf newspaperman forgotten in the wake of his calm competence. During the fevered nights, Nantan spoke of ancient pacts between his people and the mountain ghost, stories of jaguars that carried the spirits of those who had passed on, guardians of sacred places that the white settlers would never understand. News of the attack traveled ahead of them via telegraph, reaching Fort Benson and then spreading eastward along the lines that were steadily connecting the frontier to the civilized world. By the time the expedition returned to the fort, crowds had gathered, drawn by sensational accounts of a man-eating beast terrorizing the territory. Hawthorne found himself suddenly in demand, with local settlers and even some of the officers eager to hear his first-hand account of the encounter. Captain Reynolds, seeing an opportunity to enhance his own reputation, began to embellish the story, describing how he had driven the beast away with his steady aim and cool head, barely mentioning Nantan or Hawthorne, except to highlight their fear and incompetence. The fort physician tended to Nantan with barely disguised distaste, pronouncing the wounds likely fatal before returning to attend the white soldiers suffering from nothing more serious than saddle sores and sunburn. Hawthorne installed himself at Nantan's bedside, continuing the treatments that had kept the tracker alive during the journey back. When questioned about his dedication to an Apache, Hawthorne simply replied that a good reporter always protected his sources. In truth, a bond had formed between the two men, outcasts finding common ground in a world that had little use for either of them. Hawthorne sent telegrams to his editor, promising a series of articles about the expedition, but kept the detail of the bone necklace to himself, honoring the privacy of Nantan grief. As word spread about the jaguar, debates erupted in the surrounding settlements. In veterans' halls and church parlors, conversations turned to manifest destiny and the taming of the wilderness. Some saw the jaguar as just another obstacle to progress, a beast to be hunted down and destroyed like the buffalo before it. Others, particularly those who had lived longest on the frontier, spoke of omens and warnings, wondering if the natural world itself was pushing back against the relentless expansion. Hawthorne listened to these debates, recording the perspectives in his notebook while withholding judgment, his years as a war correspondent having taught him the value of observing before concluding. Against all expectations, Nantan began to recover, his strength returning slowly but steadily under Hawthorne care. The tracker spoke more openly now about his lost son and the significance of the bone necklace. "It was carved from the rib of a jaguar that my grandfather killed," Nantan explained during one of their long conversations in the fort infirmary. "My son wore it always, a connection to our ancestors and their strength. When he disappeared during the raid on our camp 7 seasons ago, I believe the necklace was lost forever. The Jaguar brings it back now for a reason. Hawthorne dutifully recorded these words, though he kept these pages separate from his official reporting, sensing that some stories were not his to tell. Captain Reynolds grew increasingly uncomfortable with the attention Hawthorne was receiving and the questions being raised about his own account of the encounter. The officer began to pressure the fort commander to discharge Nantan and send Hawthorne back east, arguing that their presence was disrupting discipline and spreading superstitious nonsense among the local population. The captain found allies among the local cattle ranchers, who were offering substantial bounties for anyone who killed the Jaguar. They viewed Nantan with suspicion, suggesting that perhaps the Apache was somehow responsible for leading the predator to their herds, a ridiculous notion that nevertheless gained traction among those predisposed to distrust native peoples. 1 month after the attack, Nantan was deemed well enough to leave the fort infirmary. With no official status or assignment, he was expected to simply depart, his years of service to the army counting for nothing now that he was considered a liability. Hawthorne, drawing on his connections back east, arranged for Nantan to be hired as his personal guide, officially employed by the newspaper to assist with a series of articles about the changing frontier. This arrangement raised eyebrows, but the fort commander, mindful of potential negative publicity, allowed it to proceed. Hawthorne secured a small cabin on the outskirts of the settlement that had grown up around the fort, a place where he and Nantan could work without constant scrutiny. Nantan made it clear from the beginning that his recovery had a purpose beyond mere survival. "I must find the Jaguar," he told Hawthorne one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of fire. "The cat carries the spirit of my son, returned to show me something important." Hawthorne, who had seen too much in his long career to dismiss such beliefs, nodded his understanding. "I will come with you," he replied. "My final story waits in the same direction." Nantan smiled for the first time since their journey began, a recognition passing between them that transcended their different backgrounds and beliefs. The obstacles to their plan were substantial and immediate. Captain Reynolds, embarrassed by the contradictions between his account and the stories now appearing in Eastern newspapers based on Hawthorne reports, used his influence to restrict their movements. Supply requisitions were denied, permits for travel beyond the settlement boundaries were delayed, and rumors were spread about the mental stability of both the half-deaf reporter and the Apache tracker. Local merchants, taking their cue from the military leadership, refused to sell to Hawthorne and Nantan, forcing them to rely on the goodwill of a few settlers who had reasons of their own to distrust authority. Among these allies was Sarah Hollister, a widow who operated a small general store and post office on the edge of the settlement. Mrs. Hollister had lost her husband during the Apache Wars, but unlike many widows, she placed the blame on the politicians and military leaders who had pursued conflict instead of understanding. She provided Hawthorne and Nantan with supplies on credit, accepting installment payments from the modest funds Hawthorne received from his newspaper. More importantly, she shared information gathered from travelers and traders who passed through her store, helping them map the movements of the Jaguar based on sightings and livestock attacks. Another unexpected ally emerged in the form of Dr. Thomas Woodward, a young physician newly arrived from Philadelphia, who had taken over the practice of the previous fort doctor. Woodward continued to check on Nantan wounds, bringing medicines and fresh bandages to their cabin, despite the disapproval of his military patients. The doctor harbored a fascination with native healing practices and spent hours discussing remedies with Nantan, each learning from the other in an exchange that benefited both. Woodward also suffered from partial hearing loss in one ear, the result of a childhood illness, and developed a genuine rapport with Hawthorne, who shared techniques for coping with the disability in a world designed for those with perfect hearing. As autumn approached, bringing slightly cooler temperatures to the territory, Hawthorne and Nantan began making short expeditions into the surrounding wilderness, ostensibly gathering material for newspaper articles, but actually tracking the Jaguar movements. They were careful to travel when Captain Reynolds was occupied with official duties or entertaining visitors from Tucson, returning before their absence could be officially noted. These journeys revealed a pattern to the Jaguar appearances, a circular route that always returned to the Santa Cruz Wash where they had first encountered the great cat. Nantan believed this was significant, suggesting that something important waited for them in that labyrinth of stone and shadow. The antagonism from Captain Reynolds escalated when he discovered that Dr. Woodward was visiting the cabin regularly. The young physician was summoned to the Fort Commander office and informed that his position would be reconsidered if he continued to associate with undesirable elements. Woodward, displaying more backbone than his predecessor, pointed out that his contract allowed him to treat civilian patients and that medical ethics required him to provide care to all who needed it. This principled stand earned him the respect of many settlers, but further isolated him from the military hierarchy, adding another outcast to the small circle forming around Hawthorne and Nantan. Mrs. Hollister faced similar pressure when a military procurement officer informed her that the fort would no longer purchase supplies from her store if she continued to serve Hawthorne and Nantan. The widow responded by posting a sign in her window stating that all customers were welcome regardless of background or association, a declaration that cost her military business, but earned her loyalty from many settlers who had grown weary of the fort arbitrary authority. The small community of outcasts supported each other through these challenges, sharing resources and information while planning for the journey that Nantan insisted they must eventually undertake. The catalyst for action came in early November, when the first snows dusted the higher elevations and cattle began to be moved to winter pastures. A group of ranchers, led by a wealthy landowner named Harrison Blake, announced the formation of a hunting party dedicated to killing the jaguar once and for all. Blake, who had been acquiring struggling homesteads and expanding his holdings throughout the territory, framed the hunt as a public service while privately boasting about adding a rare jaguar head to his trophy collection. Captain Reynolds publicly endorsed the initiative, providing military escorts and equipment to the hunting party, while suggesting that those who opposed the hunt were enemies of progress. Nantan, now fully recovered from his physical wounds, recognized that time was running short. The hunting party would depart in 3 days, with more than 20 men and a pack of trained hunting dogs from Blake Easton Estates. "If we wait, the spirit of my son will be mounted on a wall like a common beast," Nantan told Hawthorne as they sat by the fire in their cabin. "We must leave tonight, while the moon is dark." Hawthorne agreed, having already packed his essential reporting tools and enough supplies for a week in the wilderness. Dr. Woodward arrived shortly after nightfall, bringing additional medical supplies and news that Reynolds had posted guards on the main trails leading from the settlement. Mrs. Hollister provided the solution, arriving at the cabin well after midnight with her delivery wagon. "You can hide beneath the canvas," she explained, pointing to the wagon bed filled with goods. "I have deliveries to make to the Wilkins homestead near the Western Trail. From there, you can reach the old miner's path that leads toward the Santa Cruz Wash." Grateful for her assistance but concerned for her safety, Hawthorne pressed payment into her hand, along with letters to be posted to his editor and to certain influential contacts back east. "If we do not return within 2 weeks, please mail these," he instructed the widow, who nodded her understanding of the implied insurance policy. The plan worked perfectly, with Hawthorne and Nantan slipping away from the settlement before dawn, traveling concealed in the delivery wagon until they reached the isolated Wilkins homestead. From there, they proceeded on foot, following game trails and dry creek beds to avoid leaving tracks that the hunting party might later discover. Nantan moved with the renewed vigor of purpose, his knowledge of the terrain allowing them to cover substantial ground despite traveling during the cooler night hours and hiding during the day. Hawthorne kept detailed notes of their journey, recording not just their progress, but the transformation of the landscape as they moved deeper into the wilderness, away from telegraph poles and cavalry patrols. The Santa Cruz Wash appeared before them on the 3rd day, a vast network of sandstone canyons carved by ancient waters that flowed perhaps once in a generation during rare floods. Nantan led them unerringly to the site of their previous encounter with the jaguar, the place where the cattle had been arranged in their ceremonial pattern. No traces remained of that incident, the desert having reclaimed all evidence, but Nantan seemed to know exactly where they needed to go next. "The cat has been here recently," he informed Hawthorne, pointing to marks on the stone that the newspaper man could barely discern. It leads us deeper, to the place of old stories. They made camp in a sheltered alcove as darkness fell, building only the smallest of fires to warm their coffee and cook a sparse meal of dried meat and beans. Hawthorne noticed that Nantan seemed increasingly alert, his head tilting slightly at sounds too faint for the half-deaf reporter to detect. "Something watches us," Nantan confirmed when questioned. "But not the jaguar yet. Others have followed our path." Concerned that the hunting party had somehow discovered their plan, Hawthorne suggested they move deeper into the canyon system under cover of darkness, a proposal that Nantan readily accepted. They doused their fire and gathered their minimal gear, proceeding by the light of stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear desert sky. Their nighttime journey took them through increasingly narrow passages, the sandstone walls rising higher on either side until they were walking along the bottom of a natural corridor, barely wide enough for their shoulders. Nantan moved confidently despite the challenging terrain, occasionally stopping to touch marks on the canyon walls that Hawthorne realized were ancient handprints and symbols left by peoples who had inhabited this land long before Europeans arrived. The passage eventually opened into a circular space surrounded by towering cliffs, a natural amphitheater with a small spring bubbling up from the center to create a pool of precious water. "The water tastes of minerals that heal," Nantan explained as they refilled their canteens. "My grandfather spoke of this place, the sacred meeting ground where our people once communed with the spirit world." They made camp beside the pool, and Hawthorne noticed that Nantan seemed more relaxed here, despite his earlier warnings about being followed. "This place is protected," the tracker explained, settling himself cross-legged on a flat stone beside the water. "The jaguar will find us when the time is right." Hawthorne took the opportunity to organize his notes by the light of a small fire, recording descriptions of the hidden oasis and the sense of timelessness that permeated the air. Despite his usual journalistic detachment, he found himself writing more personally about his friendship with Nantan and the strange journey that had brought two outcasts to this secret place, far from the advancing frontier of telegraph lines and military outposts. Morning brought the discovery that they were not alone in the canyon. Hawthorne awoke to find Nantan already alert, staring across the pool to where 3 Apache men stood watching them silently. For a moment, Hawthorne feared they had walked into a trap, but Nantan raised his hand in a gesture of peaceful greeting that was returned by the leader of the small group. "These are from my band, those who refused to surrender to the reservations," Nantan explained as the men approached cautiously. "They have been watching us since we entered the sacred lands, making sure of our purpose." The men spoke with Nantan in their own language, occasionally glancing at Hawthorne with expressions that seemed more curious than hostile. The leader of the group, an older man with deeply lined features who introduced himself as Caton, explained through Nantan that they had been tracking the jaguar themselves, believing it to be a powerful medicine spirit. They had observed its unusual behavior, the way it seemed to be drawing certain people toward the sacred canyon, and had decided to watch rather than interfere. When Nantan showed them the bone necklace and explained its connection to his lost son, the Apache men nodded in understanding. "The cat chooses who it reveals itself to," Caton stated, settling beside their fire, as if continuing a conversation long in progress. "It has chosen both of you for a purpose that will become clear." Throughout that day, Hawthorne observed the interaction between Nantan and his kinsman with journalist attention to detail, noting how they shared information about the changing territory beyond the canyon and the movements of both military patrols and civilian settlers. The Free Apache maintained a network of communication that operated entirely outside the awareness of the army, passing news through hidden camps and secret trails that had never appeared on any military map. They confirmed that the hunting party led by Harrison Blake had indeed departed from the settlement, but had been deliberately misdirected by signs and tracks that led away from the Santa Cruz Wash, buying precious time for whatever was meant to occur at the hidden spring. As evening approached, Caton and his companions prepared to depart, explaining that what would happen next was meant for Nantan and Hawthorne alone. Before leaving, the older man pressed something into Hawthorne's hand, a small pouch containing dried herbs and berries. "For clear vision when the moment comes," he explained through Nantan. "The truth requires eyes that see beyond the surface." With that cryptic instruction, the three Apache melted back into the shadows of the canyon, leaving Hawthorne and Nantan once again alone beside the spring. Nantan instructed Hawthorne to add the contents of the pouch to their evening coffee, explaining that the mixture would help them remain alert through the night when the jaguar was most likely to appear. The bitter herbs made the coffee almost unpalatable, but Hawthorne drank his portion without complaint, trusting that Nantan understood the customs of his own people better than any outsider could. As darkness settled over the canyon, they built up their fire and positioned themselves on opposite sides, creating a circle of light around the spring. The stars emerged one by one, filling the narrow slice of sky visible between the canyon walls with brilliant points of light that reflected in the still surface of the pool. Neither man spoke much, each lost in his own thoughts and preparations for whatever revelation awaited them in this hidden place. The jaguar came with the rising of the moon, its golden spotted coat catching the silvery light as it appeared on a ledge high above the spring. Both men saw it at the same moment, freezing in place as the great cat surveyed them with unblinking amber eyes. It seemed even larger than Hawthorne remembered, its powerful shoulders and massive head suggesting strength beyond that of ordinary predators. The jaguar descended the cliff face with impossible grace, finding footholds where none seemed to exist, until it stood at the edge of the firelight, regarding the two men with what Hawthorne could only interpret as deliberate intelligence. Nantan slowly raised his hand, showing the bone necklace that now hung around his own neck, a gesture that caused the jaguar to move closer to the fire rather than retreating. What happened next would forever remain difficult for Hawthorne to describe in words that others might believe. The jaguar circled their camp 3 times, each circuit bringing it closer to Nantan, who remained perfectly still with the bone necklace clearly visible. On the 3rd pass, the great cat stopped directly before the Apache tracker and sat on its haunches like a domestic tabby, their eyes locked in silent communion. Hawthorne watched in amazement as Nantan began to speak softly in his native language, words that seemed to hold meaning for the jaguar, whose ears flicked forward with attentive focus. The fire burned lower, its light dimming until the 3 figures were illuminated primarily by moonlight, reflecting off the surface of the spring. Hawthorne felt a strange shift in his perception, perhaps influenced by the herbs from Katin pouch, as the boundaries between the jaguar and the moonlight seemed to blur and reform. For a moment that stretched beyond normal reckoning of time, he saw not just the cat, but a shadowy human figure superimposed over it, a young Apache warrior with features that echoed those of Nantan. The apparition lasted only seconds before resolving back into the form of the jaguar, but Hawthorne knew with journalist certainty that he had glimpsed something genuine, a truth beyond ordinary understanding. Nantan continued his soft monologue, tears now streaming freely down his weathered cheeks as he addressed the jaguar as one would a beloved child long absent. The jaguar rose and moved to the edge of the spring, lowering its massive head to drink from the mineral-rich waters. When it raised its head again, droplets falling from its whiskers caught the moonlight like scattered diamonds. The cat turned its attention to Hawthorne now, approaching the newspaper man with deliberate steps that should have inspired terror, but somehow communicated only purpose. Hawthorne remained motionless as the jaguar came within touching distance, close enough that he could feel its warm breath and see the individual spots in its golden coat. The cat lowered its head and dropped something from its mouth onto the ground before Hawthorne, a small object that landed with a soft thud on the sand. When the jaguar stepped back, Hawthorne reached down with trembling fingers to retrieve what had been delivered to him. It was a small leather journal, its cover weathered and stained, but still intact, with the initials CH burned into the bottom right corner. Hawthorne recognized it instantly as belonging to his brother Caleb, who had disappeared in the Southwest Territories nearly 15 years earlier, while documenting the conflicts between settlers and native peoples. The journal had been considered lost forever, along with Caleb himself, presumed killed by hostile Apaches, according to the official army reports that Hawthorne had never fully believed. The jaguar retreated to sit beside Nantan once more, watching as Hawthorne opened the journal with fingers that could barely manage the simple task. Inside, he found his brother's familiar handwriting, the final entries describing his discovery of Army massacres of peaceful Apache camps, atrocities that had been covered up and blamed on tribal violence. Caleb had documented names, dates, and locations, building a case that would have destroyed military careers and challenged the narrative of manifest destiny that drove westward expansion. The last entry indicated his intention to meet with a sympathetic newspaper editor in Tucson, a journey he had never completed. Tucked between the pages was a faded photograph of a young Apache woman holding an infant, with an inscription on the back in Caleb handwriting, "My wife, Morning Star, and our son." Hawthorne looked up from the journal to find Nantan watching him with eyes that held both understanding and question. The tracker gestured to the photograph, then to the jaguar sitting calmly beside him. "The spirit returns what was lost," Nantan said simply. "My son and your brother were connected in ways hidden until now." The jaguar rose and stretched, powerful muscles rippling beneath its spotted coat, before moving to the edge of the firelight. It turned back once more to regard both men, its gaze lingering first on Nantan and then on Hawthorne in what felt like a final farewell. Then the great cat melted into the shadows of the canyon, leaving the two men alone with their discoveries and the weight of decisions that now lay before them. Dawn found Hawthorne and Nantan still seated by the dying embers of their fire, the journal open between them as they pieced together a story that connected their separate losses. Caleb Hawthorne had been secretly married to a woman from Nantan band, their union producing a son who would have been Nantan's nephew. When the Army discovered Caleb documentation of their illegal actions against peaceful Apache bands, they had staged a raid on the small family camp, killing Caleb and his wife while reporting the incident as an Apache attack on a lone traveler. The infant son had been taken by a sympathetic cavalry scout and delivered to Nantan, who raised the boy as his own without knowing his true parentage. That son had worn the jaguar bone necklace until he too was lost in a later raid, his body never recovered. The implications of these revelations stretched far beyond personal grief or closure. Caleb's journal contained evidence that contradicted 15 years of official military history in the territory, exposing systematic violence against peaceful native bands and the corruption of officers who had built careers on fabricated reports of Apache aggression. Among the names repeatedly mentioned was that of Major Walter Reynolds, now Captain Reynolds of Fort Benson, who had led several of the documented massacres and personally ordered the attack that killed Caleb and his Apache wife. The journal provided dates, locations, and even names of witnesses who might still be located to corroborate the accounts. As the morning sun began to warm the canyon, Hawthorne and Nantan faced the question of what to do with the recovered truth. The obvious course would be to take the journal directly to the territorial governor or to newspaper editors in Tucson, exposing the crimes and seeking justice for both their lost family members. Yet they recognized that such action would likely be countered by military authorities who would move quickly to discredit the journal and silence anyone connected to it. Reynolds and his allies would stop at nothing to protect themselves from exposure, particularly given their current standing in territorial society. The hunting party led by Harrison Blake provided additional complications, as the wealthy rancher was known to have political ambitions built on his reputation as a civilizing force on the frontier. The decision came with the discovery of one final entry in the journal, a coded message written in a cipher that the Hawthorne brothers had developed in childhood. Beneath an apparently mundane description of desert flora was the location of a metal strongbox in which Caleb had placed duplicates of his most damning evidence, including sworn statements from witnesses and Army financial records showing payments for Apache scalps, regardless of age or gender. If the box remained where Caleb had hidden it, in a cave system not far from the present settlement around Fort Benson, it would provide corroboration that even military authorities would struggle to dismiss. More importantly, it would ensure that the truth did not depend solely on a single recovered journal that could too easily be destroyed. Nantan and Hawthorne formulated their plan carefully, knowing that they would have only one opportunity to expose the truth in a manner that could not be suppressed. They would return to the settlement separately, Nantan traveling through the hidden trails known to his people, while Hawthorne took a more visible route that would attract the attention of any search parties. Before parting, they transferred the most critical pages from the journal to a waterproof pouch that Nantan concealed beneath his clothing, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if one of them was captured. They agreed to meet in 3 days at the cabin of Dr. Woodward, who lived far enough from the fort to provide some measure of privacy for their reunion. The return journey proved even more challenging than Hawthorne had anticipated. He encountered the hunting party on the second day, their dogs picking up his scent despite his efforts to travel through rocky terrain that would minimize tracks. Harrison Blake himself intercepted Hawthorne on the trail, a dozen armed men spreading out to ensure the newspaperman could not escape. Blake was visibly disappointed to find Hawthorne alone, having hoped to capture both the reporter and Nantan together. "Where is your Apache friend, Hawthorne? And what did you find out there in the wilderness?" Blake demanded, making no effort to disguise his contempt. Hawthorne provided vague answers about pursuing his story about the jaguar, explaining that Nantan had decided to continue tracking the cat while he returned to file his report. Blake was clearly suspicious, but had no legitimate reason to detain a respected newspaperman with connections to Eastern publications. He allowed Hawthorne to continue toward the settlement, but assigned 2 of his men to accompany him, ostensibly as protection, but clearly serving as guards to monitor his movements. The forced companions made conversation impossible with any settlers they passed, and Hawthorne realized that Blake was attempting to control what information reached the community. By the time they arrived at the settlement, word had spread that Hawthorne had been found wandering alone and confused in the wilderness, his Apache guide having abandoned him to the elements, a narrative that Blake was actively encouraging to discredit anything the reporter might reveal. Captain Reynolds was waiting at the fort gates, his expression a mixture of triumph and barely contained anger as Hawthorne was brought before him. The officer made a show of concern for the reporter's health while ordering him confined to the fort infirmary for observation, effectively placing him under house arrest without calling it such. Dr. Woodward was conspicuously absent, having been sent to attend a supposed medical emergency at a distant ranch, leaving Hawthorne under the supervision of an Army medical orderly who reported directly to Reynolds. The captain made it clear that once Hawthorne had rested, he would be expected to provide a full account of his activities in the wilderness, with particular emphasis on the whereabouts of Nantan, who was now being described as a deserter from Army service. Isolated in the infirmary, Hawthorne realized that his situation was more precarious than he had initially assessed. Reynolds had clearly recognized the threat posed by Hawthorne's unexplained absence and was moving to control the narrative before any revelations could emerge. The officer had positioned guards outside the infirmary and instructed the orderly to monitor any visitors, effectively cutting Hawthorne off from potential allies within the settlement. Even Mrs. Hollister was turned away when she attempted to bring supplies, told that the reporter was too unwell to receive visitors and would be transported to Tucson for proper medical care as soon as his condition stabilized. The turning point came on the second night of his confinement, when a small stone wrapped in cloth struck the window of the infirmary. Hawthorne retrieved the projectile to find a message from Dr. Woodward, who had returned to the settlement and learned of the situation. The young physician had created the diversion of a minor fire in the stables to draw away the guards, providing Hawthorne with a brief opportunity to escape through the window and make his way to a wagon waiting behind the laundry building. The message included precise timing and a warning to bring only what could be carried in his pockets, as there would be no time for gathering belongings. The escape went precisely as planned, with Hawthorne slipping through the window during the commotion and finding Mrs. Hollister waiting with her delivery wagon, hidden beneath stacked laundry until they were safely beyond the fort perimeter. The widow drove directly to the small church that served the civilian settlement, where Hawthorne was surprised to find not only Dr. Woodward waiting, but also Reverend Marshal, the elderly pastor who had long maintained a position of moral authority independent of the military leadership. Most shocking of all was the presence of Nantan, who had arrived safely and brought with him not only the hidden pages from Caleb's journal, but 3 of his Apache kinsmen, including Kaitin. This unlikely gathering represented a coalition of outcasts and independent thinkers, each with reasons to question the official narratives that had shaped the territory. Reverend Marshal had long harbored doubts about reports of Apache aggression, having ministered to wounded survivors whose stories contradicted military accounts. Dr. Woodward had discovered discrepancies in medical records during his review of the fort archives, finding evidence of civilian casualties classified as combat deaths. Mrs. Hollister had her own experiences of military deception, having eventually learned that her husband's death had resulted from an officer incompetence rather than the Apache ambush described in official reports. Together with Nantan and his kinsman, they formed a council of witnesses whose combined testimony would be difficult to dismiss. The immediate concern was retrieving the strongbox described in Caleb's final journal entry. Caton confirmed that he knew the cave system mentioned, having used it as a shelter during his own band's movements through the territory. The location was now dangerously close to one of Harrison Blake's ranches, making any approach risky, particularly with the hunting party having returned to the settlement. Nantan proposed that he and his kinsman could retrieve the strongbox under cover of darkness, using their knowledge of the landscape to avoid Blake men, but Hawthorne insisted on accompanying them, determined to honor his brother's legacy by participating in the recovery of his final evidence. While they prepared for this mission, Reverend Marshal suggested a strategy for ensuring their safety and the public revelation of the evidence once recovered. The territorial governor was scheduled to visit Fort Benson in 3 days' time, accompanied by representatives from several eastern newspapers who were documenting the successful pacification of the frontier. This visit had been arranged by Captain Reynolds and Harrison Blake as a promotional opportunity, with Blake expected to announce his candidacy for territorial representative immediately following the governor inspection of the fort. The timing presented both danger and opportunity, concentrating potential enemies in one location, but also providing a public forum with witnesses who could not easily be controlled. The plan they formulated was audacious in its simplicity. Nantan and his kinsman would retrieve the strongbox that night, bringing it directly to the church where Reverend Marshal would document its contents with Dr. Woodward and Mrs. Hollister serving as additional witnesses. Hawthorne would prepare a comprehensive article based on both the journal and the strongbox evidence, copies of which would be given to each member of their small coalition for safekeeping. On the day of the governor visit, Reverend Marshal would request the opportunity to offer an invocation at the public ceremony, using this role to create a moment in which Hawthorne could present the evidence directly to the governor and the assembled press, making suppression impossible. The retrieval of the strongbox proved more challenging than anticipated, but ultimately successful. Nantan led Hawthorne and Caton through a series of ravines that brought them to the cave entrance without crossing Blake land directly. The box was exactly where Caleb had described, concealed behind a fall of rocks that appeared natural but had been carefully arranged to create a hidden chamber. The metal container had protected its contents perfectly through the years, preserving documents, photographs, and even a small journal kept by Morning Star, Caleb Apache wife, describing her observations of military movements and attacks on peaceful camps. This unexpected addition provided a perspective that had been systematically erased from official accounts, the voice of a native woman documenting the destruction of her people. Upon their return to the church, the group worked through the night, organizing the evidence into a compelling narrative that could not easily be dismissed as frontier fantasy. Dr. Woodward provided medical context for records of civilian casualties, while Reverend Marshal contributed his own documentation of discrepancies between military reports and settler accounts of various incidents. Mrs. Hollister added testimony regarding supply requisitions that had been diverted for personal use by officers, including Captain Reynolds, building a picture of corruption that extended beyond the violence itself. By dawn, they had created multiple copies of a comprehensive dossier, each hidden in locations known only to individual members of the coalition. The day of the governor visit dawned clear and cool, the settlement transformed by flags and bunting erected to welcome the territorial representative and his entourage. Captain Reynolds had organized a military parade and inspection, while Harrison Blake had arranged for a community luncheon where he planned to announce his political ambitions with the governor blessing. Security was visible throughout the settlement, with Army personnel checking the credentials of anyone approaching the fort or the speaking platform erected in the central square. Hawthorne remained hidden in the church until the ceremony began, while Nantan and his kinsmen watched from concealed positions on the surrounding hillsides, ready to bear witness or intervene as circumstances required. The ceremony proceeded according to military precision, with Captain Reynolds welcoming the governor and introducing distinguished guests, including Harrison Blake, who received enthusiastic applause from his supporters among the ranchers and merchants. Reverend Marshal was invited to offer his invocation midway through the proceedings, taking his place at the podium with a quiet dignity that had earned him respect throughout the settlement. His prayer spoke of truth and justice, of the light that must shine in dark places, and the responsibility of leaders to protect all people regardless of origin or circumstance. As he concluded, he introduced Daniel Hawthorne as a distinguished journalist with an important matter to bring before the assembly. The appearance of Hawthorne caused an immediate stir, with Captain Reynolds starting forward only to be restrained by protocol in the governor's presence. Hawthorne approached the podium carrying a leather portfolio, his posture straight despite the tension visible in every line of his body. He began by introducing himself and acknowledging his long career reporting from battlefields and frontiers across the nation. "What I present today is perhaps the most important story I have ever uncovered," he stated, making eye contact with the governor rather than addressing the wider crowd. "It is the story of my brother Caleb, who disappeared in this territory 15 years ago while documenting the truth of relations between settlers and the Apache people." Hawthorne proceeded methodically, presenting first the recovered journal and then selected documents from the strongbox, each piece building upon the previous to create an undeniable pattern of official misconduct and deliberately falsified reports. He named names, including that of Captain Reynolds, and provided specific dates and locations where peaceful Apache bands had been attacked without provocation, their deaths reported as victories against hostile forces. The evidence extended to financial records, showing how certain officers had profited from these operations, receiving promotions and commendations based on fabricated accounts of heroism against a largely invented enemy. As Hawthorne spoke, the crowd reaction shifted from initial shock to growing murmurs of confirmation, particularly among older settlers who had witnessed the disparities between official reports and their own experiences. Captain Reynolds attempted to interrupt several times, his face flushing with anger and fear, but the governor raised his hand for silence, his expression grave as he examined the documents being presented. Harrison Blake moved strategically toward the edge of the platform, clearly calculating his best path for disassociation from the unfolding scandal, but found his exit blocked by Dr. Woodward and several church elders who had positioned themselves at the stairs. The climax came when Nantan emerged from the crowd, the jaguar bone necklace clearly visible against his shirt as he mounted the steps to join Hawthorne at the podium. The tracker spoke briefly but powerfully about his discovery that his adopted son had been the child of Caleb Hawthorne and an Apache woman, both killed under orders from then Major Reynolds. He described the jaguar that had led them to the hidden truth, an account that might have been dismissed as superstition, if not for the physical evidence now spread before the governor and the press representatives. "That evidence speaks with a voice that cannot be silenced," Nantan concluded, standing shoulder to shoulder with Hawthorne in a visual representation of their shared purpose. Captain Reynolds finally broke protocol entirely, rushing forward to declare the entire presentation a fabrication designed to discredit the army and undermine territorial security. His outburst only served to focus attention more directly on his own role in the documented atrocities, particularly when the governor inquired specifically about his presence at several locations mentioned in Caleb's journal. Reynolds' denial became increasingly incoherent as he realized the extent of the evidence arrayed against him, culminating in a demand that the Apache be removed from the platform and Hawthorne arrested for spreading seditious falsehoods. The governor, a career politician with a keen sense for which way the wind was blowing, recognized that the documentation presented was too comprehensive to be dismissed and too public to be suppressed. He thanked Hawthorne for bringing these serious allegations to light and announced the immediate formation of a special commission to investigate all claims, with representatives from the territorial court, the press, and local civilian leadership. Captain Reynolds was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, a diplomatic approach that acknowledged the gravity of the accusations while maintaining the appearance of due process. Harrison Blake found his political aspirations effectively ended before they were officially announced, his association with Reynolds and similar frontier policies now a liability rather than an asset. In the days that followed, the settlement experienced a reckoning with its own history, as additional witnesses came forward with accounts that supported the evidence Hawthorne had presented. The Special Commission expanded its investigation to include other military outposts in the territory, uncovering patterns of abuse and deception that had shaped policy for decades. Dr. Woodward was appointed to document the medical aspects of these findings, while Reverend Marshall provided spiritual counsel to a community struggling to reconcile its founding narratives with newly revealed truths. Mrs. Hollister's store became an unofficial clearinghouse for information, where settlers and a growing number of Apache visitors could share stories previously suppressed. Nantan received formal recognition from the territorial governor for his service in bringing the evidence to light, along with a written acknowledgement that his band had been wrongfully classified as hostile and could now move freely through their traditional territories without military harassment. The tracker chose to remain in the vicinity of the settlement, building a small cabin near the church where he could serve as a bridge between cultures during the difficult transition toward more honest relations. Katin and several families from the Free Apache Band gradually established a seasonal camp nearby, maintaining their independence while engaging in limited trade with sympathetic settlers. Hawthorne declined offers to return east as a celebrated journalist who had broken one of the most significant stories of frontier history. Instead, he accepted the position of editor for the small territorial newspaper, transforming it from a military mouthpiece into a forum for diverse voices from throughout the region. His regular column, titled Echoes from the Wilderness, often featured insights gained during his continuing expeditions with Nantan, documenting both the natural wonders of the territory and the traditional knowledge of its original inhabitants. The half-deaf reporter found his disability no longer mattered in a community that had learned to value truth spoken quietly over authority proclaimed loudly. The jaguar was never seen again in the vicinity of the settlement, though stories of its appearance emerged occasionally from remote areas of the territory. Nantan maintained that the spirit had completed its purpose in reuniting the sundered family lines and revealing the hidden truth, returning now to the borderlands where such powerful beings properly belonged. Hawthorne neither confirmed nor denied this interpretation in his writings, preferring to leave room for mystery in a world too often reduced to simple categorizations of fact and fiction, civilized and savage, progress and superstition. 10 years later, as the Arizona Territory moved toward statehood, an aging Daniel Hawthorne sat on the porch of his small house on the outskirts of what had grown into a proper town, no longer merely a settlement attached to a military outpost. Beside him, equally weathered by time, Nantan carved a small bone amulet similar to the one that had led them on their remarkable journey. A young woman approached up the dusty road, carrying a portfolio of papers and a determined expression. Miss Catherine Marshall, the reverend granddaughter and Hawthorne's most promising apprentice at the newspaper, had been collecting accounts from throughout the territory for a special edition commemorating the formal acknowledgement of historic wrongs against the Apache people. The legislation she described, recently passed by the Territorial Assembly, established protected lands and hunting rights for the remaining free bands, along with educational opportunities for their children that respected traditional knowledge alongside modern subjects. The formal apology incorporated language from Caleb Hawthorne Journal and Morning Star writings, acknowledging the deliberate campaign of violence that had been disguised as defensive warfare. Catherine explained that she wanted to include personal reflections from those who had lived through the transition, particularly the unlikely partnership that had sparked the original revelations. Hawthorne glanced at Nantan, who nodded his approval for sharing their story once more. The newspaper man adjusted his hearing aid, a more effective device than had been available in his earlier years, and began recounting the tale of two outcasts who had found common purpose in the pursuit of a golden-spotted cat that moved like shadow between shadow. As he spoke, Catherine took rapid notes, occasionally interjecting questions that demonstrated her inherited commitment to accuracy and context. The young reporter represented a new generation that had not personally experienced the events being described, but recognized their continuing relevance to the evolving identity of the territory. When the interview concluded and Catherine had departed with her precious notes, Hawthorne and Nantan sat in companionable silence watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The world had changed around them, with automobiles now occasionally rattling past on the road and electric lights beginning to appear in town buildings. Yet the essential truths they had uncovered remained constant, a foundation upon which a more honest community could build. We were the unlikely messengers, Hawthorne reflected as darkness gradually claimed the landscape. The most important stories often come from those society has cast aside. Nantan nodded in agreement, adding another careful cut to the bone amulet, taking shape beneath his skilled hands. How many silent heroes built this land, he responded softly. Those who preserved truth when power demanded silence. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound echoing across valleys where telegraph poles had given way to telephone lines, but where the ancient rhythms of the desert continued beneath the veneer of progress. The frontiers had shifted, but never truly vanished, Hawthorne mused, and there would always be a need for those willing to venture beyond comfortable boundaries in pursuit of hidden truths. He had found his final story, the one worthy of concluding his long career, not in sensational headlines, but in the patient unraveling of deceptions that had shaped a territory. The half-deaf reporter and the Apache tracker, outcasts who had become cornerstones of a community reckoning with its complex legacy, sat together as the first stars appeared, each carrying memories of a golden-spotted cat that had led them to an unexpected shared destiny.